This episode, I'm joined by Jeffries Martin to discuss his book, A Beautiful Ending, The Apocalyptic Imagination and the Making of the Modern World. I'd like to wish all my patrons, listeners, subscribers, and followers a great New Year's Eve. And if you've enjoyed anything that I've made this year, then please think about supporting the podcast via the links in the description below. Otherwise, have a great night and enjoy. So, Jeffries Martin, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Delighted to be here, James. Thank you for inviting me.
We are going to be discussing your book, A Beautiful Ending, The Apocalyptic Imagination and the Making of the Modern World, which was published by Yale University Press in 2022, so this year. And as people can probably imagine, it is a book about the overlap between how the modern world is constructed in a certain sense, but the underlying factor of the last days, the end is nigh, the apocalypse, and how the ideas of, social, communal, religious forms of people saying the end is coming, the end is nigh, all this is going to end, and how these ideas have formed what we consider to be the modern world, and how these ideas of the end, quite sort of paradoxically, how the end, which hasn't arrived, has changed throughout history. And it's a fascinating book, fascinating little historical book in a way. But before we jump in with all these ideas, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how this book, came about.
Well, I am a professor of history, and I've been at this craft for a long time. I've always had a fascination with the history of religion. I've wondered constantly throughout my life to what degree is religion a product of the social order, and to what degree is the social order a product of religion? So it's been a kind of perennial question. And how this particular book came about remains to me a bit mysterious, but certainly part of it was a frustration in my teaching that we compartmentalize religion when we talk about, for example, I teach a survey of early modern European history. And we tend to talk about religion when we talk about the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, but we don't talk about religion in other conversations when we talk about politics or the natural sciences, for example. And I saw apocalypticism as a kind of way in which one could bring religion into what might ostensibly seem like secular topics. And I think that was a strong motivation for writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in a way, you think when we bracket off all these things and we bracket out religions, it's not really anything to do with these other things. What we're bracketing out in a way is this very clear religious discussion of, okay, this is all great now, but what's the end? What's coming? And are you guys going to, that's how you find meaning in a way, right? Is, well, what's coming after all of this? What's at the end? And that's how, would you say that they need that discussion of the apocalypse or the end writ large? Because, well, what are you doing if you're not focused towards the end?
Well, I think that's true. I would perhaps say in a preliminary way that the focus on the end, on eschatology, is not necessary in all conversations about the way in which religion permeates, say, the study of science or the creation of political societies. Mm-hmm. But in the early modern period, it became my kind of conviction, the more and more I read on this theme, that in fact people were thinking and worrying about and hoping for the end of history, and that their thoughts about this had a huge impact on their activity and their lives. It put them into what we might call a kind of sacred drama, that God had created the world and God would bring the world to an end. Mm. And where did they stand in this arc of time between the beginning and the end? And what role did they have in building on what had come before, transforming what was there, and preparing for the end?
Mm. Okay. I see. I like the idea of a sacred drama. I'll make a note. We could probably bring that in. But before we jump in with the big themes of your book and of your writing, I, of course, have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
So I love this question, and it's a hard question that you're a guest to think about. So I thought it would be interesting, given the fact that my book attempts to talk about apocalypticism not only within the Christian tradition, but also within Judaism and Islam, to have a thinker from each one of those three traditions. And the three thinkers that I picked are the Islamic jurist and historian Ibn Khaldun of the 14th century, the well-known figure of Niccolo Machiavelli from the early 16th century, and a much less well-known figure than the other two, a Jewish physician and historian living in Genoa by the name of Joseph HaKohen in the mid and late 16th century.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to assume that between these three there is a line of apocalypticism.
There was between these three a fascination with historical and social and political change. Mm-hmm. And each one of them also thought seriously about prophecy and how prophecy works within history. So they would be, I think, individuals who might be, this is a long shot, but might be vaguely interested in my book, A Beautiful Ending, because I'm also thinking about that. How do we make sense of historical change in relationship to apocalyptic beliefs?
Were the other two? So I don't know. I've done an episode on Machiavelli with Alexander Lee on his biography of Machiavelli, but I don't know too much about the other two. So do the other two have a Machiavellian streak in the sense that their understanding of prophecy perhaps has an element of personal fortune about it?
Well, in the interesting thing is that this figure of Ibn Khaldun, who was an absolutely brilliant scholar, who lived in Andalusia, in Muslim Andalusia in the 14th century, and then was also active even as a student in North Africa, and eventually was in Cairo. So he's somewhat itinerant. He was an acute observer of the Islamic world and was fascinated by the rise and fall of dynasties. Mm-hmm. And he connected the rise and fall of dynasties to Islamic beliefs in their messianic figure, the Mahdi, and when the Mahdi would come. And he expressed he, in my view, has a relatively strong sociological view of what brings the Mahdi about. He knows that the prophecies or the expectations of the Mahdi come largely from the Islamic hadiths, the traditions about the sayings of Muhammad that were written down after Muhammad's death, that are not in the Quran, many of which are full of expectations about the end times. He was very critical of these traditions. He saw many of them as spurious, but at the same time, he has a kind of underlying sense that there might be something to this idea. But this idea, he believes, only becomes prominent when the social conditions are right. So he would kind of represent the side of me that thinks that social life is productive of religious beliefs. And Machiavelli, he's an interesting interlocutor with Machiavelli, because Machiavelli, in the discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, talks about the founding of Rome, and he sees the giver of laws, Romulus, is very important, but not sufficient for the creation of political society. There also has to be religion in society. And so he credits Numa, following Livy, with the formation of Roman religion. But he has this very interesting discussion of what we might call Numa's pious fraud, which was a story Numa told about a conversation he'd had with a goddess who gave him the rites that the Romans should practice. And yet, it's quite clear that Numa had invented this conversation to gain credibility. And in a way, one might think, I've never proven this or seen it proven definitively, but one might think that Machiavelli's own ambivalence about the prophet Savonarola, whom he would have heard when he was a young man in Florence, played some role in this idea that prophecy is not always honest. Be that as it may, Machiavelli sees religion as fundamental to the creation of political society. Mm-hmm. And then Hacohen writes a history, and he's much less well known than the other two, but he writes a history of a kind of comparative history of the French kings and the Ottoman sultans. But he also wrote a history of the New World, which was never published, but which exists in 7 to 9 manuscripts. I don't remember the exact number. I have a colleague at Washington University who studies Hacohen. And he, too, is very interested in the forces of historical change. And he puts divine providence really at a central place in trying to explain the nature of historical change. So all three of these scholars were grappling with the prophetic and the providential and its relationship to transformations in society.
Mm. Do you think they see a benefit? I mean, Machiavelli, with that ambivalence towards the prophecies he heard when he was young, do you think maybe these figures also understand that, you know, the role that prophecy takes in building a society and constructing a civilization, I guess? Do you think that they would see it even as as a need? You know, it's beneficial even if there is that ambivalence about it.
Well, I think in Machiavelli's case, I do think he sees it as, I think he sees religion as beneficial, mm-hmm. That there's more to the construction of social life than laws and regulations and policies, that there have to be also, he would have believed, shared beliefs and values. And so in that sense, I think he sees that as beneficial. He's deeply critical of the papacy. He's deeply critical of many aspects of Christianity. He's deeply critical of, fraudulent prophets. But as a kind of early theorist of the nature of the social order, he recognizes that religion plays a salient role, a decisive role. And Ibn Khaldun shares that, as does Joseph Hacohen.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's what they would have, if they were placed in a room together, that's what they would talk about? Or do you think there might actually be something else they might discuss?
Well, I think all of them, I think they would be drawn to each other's interest in history and how one accounts for historical and political change. I think that would be at the top of their interest.
Okay. Well, I'm sure these figures will probably arise again in our discussion, but speaking of history, I guess the strange question, which is, you're writing a history of the last days or the history of the end, and the sort of the irony, I guess, is that you begin very early on, and it's sort of the question I wanted to ask you is, where does the end first begin? Which is quite a strange idea. As soon as civilization has begun, we're already always talking about the end, it seems.
Yeah, it does seem that way. And of course, I'm a student. I examine primarily this period we call the early modern period, the period from the mid-15th to the end of the 18th century. And so I'm not a specialist in the earlier period, but my understanding is that ideas about the end were already present 1,500 years BCE in Persia and the Middle East, and that these ideas would have a significant shaping influence on Judaism and eventually on Christianity, which was also deeply shaped by Judaism, and then on Islam, which was deeply shaped by Christianity and Judaism as well. And so the ideas have been there for a very long time. And I think that they seem from the outside to be, when one first reads about them, just kind of quaint and curious artifacts that couldn't possibly have much significance. But the reality is that they were profoundly significant for the ways in which societies understand themselves. And I think they remain ideas about the end, although not necessarily religious always, remain significant down to the present day. Just to give a couple of contemporary examples, because I think it's helpful in our conversation, there's the dream among Western liberals that liberal democracy is the end of history. That was Fukuyama's argument in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then there's the dream of communists that communism is the end of history. It doesn't mean that the world would end in a great implosion, but it means that history would come to an end. We would have finally settled all our scores. We would live in a world of universal peace and harmony, either through free trade or through a more managed society under communism. So we, as human beings, it seems as though we're often seeking an understanding of the future and hoping that we can shape the future in some sense. And I think that's always been part of our experience as human beings. I don't want to necessarily generalize globally, but this is my reflections on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and that these ideas were important in antiquity. They become quite important in Western Europe during the Crusades, but I believe they become really, really diffused throughout many levels of society in the early modern period.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that our contemporary, apocalypticism, or not apocalypticism, sorry, our contemporary end is still that sort of liberal ideal that eventually things will all be settled? Or do you think we've come to find a new end which we all unspeakingly or unspokenly, unconsciously, collectively agree on, maybe mostly in the West, I would say?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of disagreements about the future in the West. And certainly some of the challenges we face, climate change being, in a sense, the most prominent challenge, although concerns about nuclear war remain a huge challenge, create an environment in which there's a great deal of intensity about what the future should look like. Should we have a carbon-free future? Can we do that? Can we avoid a nuclear conflict on the planet, even as nuclear weapons seem to be proliferating around the globe? And we have evidence from the invasion of Ukraine that Putin is blatantly irresponsible in his conversations about the potential use of so-called tactical nuclear weapons. These concerns, create different reactions that run the gamut from, extremes where people are looking for a radical break from fossil fuels in the economy, to gradualists, to those who hope for a kind of miracle invention that will get us out of the dilemmas facing global warming that come from global warming. So I think it's still a kind of boisterous conversation about what the future would look like. But certainly the United States kind of ideologically would be in the liberal democracy camp.
Mm-hmm. Do you think from your book, from your studies, do you think it would has ever been or would be possible for a human, what we consider, by definition, a human civilization or society to exist, which doesn't have at least some form of end, or understanding of what an end might be?
That's a fascinating question. It's an absolutely fascinating question, because I think that, if and it's not something I know much about, but if one thinks about, say, a medieval rural agrarian civilization, with assuming the inhabitants of the civilization are hearing Christian scriptures. Nonetheless, they live in an environment which is, for their very survival, deeply defined by the seasons. And I think it's very easy in this environment that's defined by the seasons, that's agrarian, that also we could posit lives without watches and clocks, and so has a much different relationship to time than would emerge in the modern era. I think it's possible to imagine that they don't have necessarily an idea about an absolute collective end at the end of a linear progression, but probably a more cyclical view of human experience, that society persists, but individuals come and go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that would also have connections to how prevalent and, I guess right in front of you, death and suffering are in these situations? And as we move through to the early modern period and the modern day, death and suffering, of course they're still here, but there certainly seems to have been a progression of trying to push it under the rug as much as we can. We don't want to know about that anymore. And I guess when you push death and suffering away, and in that sense mortality, do you think the end tries to also hide itself as well socially?
That's such an interesting question. I think that I don't think the end is trying to hide itself socially, at least in the American context, because we have such a specific kind of religious culture in the United States, where ideas about the end times are either sincerely believed by a significant sector of evangelical Christians, or they become part of popular culture, either in film or in comedy, that there's a kind of continuing humming about the end times in the United States, which is maybe different from Western Europe. It's my sense that it is different from Western Europe. Certainly, we do sanitize our world, and we have concealed death and suffering as much as possible from the quotidian experience that we have, and that's been a huge change that I think has been predominantly something that's come about in the course of the 20th century. I think before the 20th century that people were there when their relatives died, or they encountered death much more immediately than we are likely to do. So I'm not sure that change explains or would explain the recession of thinking about the end times, but it's worth pondering that, James. That's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one thing that's always interesting, and I don't know if you've come across it, there's a fascinating Wikipedia page now called, it's just a list, and it's a list of prophecies that didn't come true. And I think it's fantastic because almost every year is on there now, accounted for. And it seems we're constantly, as the human race in general, is constantly saying, well, this is the, I mean, dare we say it, this is the exact year, the exact day when everything's going to come to an end. And historically, do you see a pattern in the way civilizations, nations, religions deal with the fact that the end times haven't arrived, haven't come? And I was reading in preparation for a talk that I'm doing this Friday. There's a great writer, Albert Schweitzer, who writes about how you can actually read early Christianity and the time of Christ and Christ himself as an extremely eschatological prophet, in the sense that the apostles actually thought, and this is Schweitzer's sort of reading, the apostles even thought that Christ was talking about, and quite literally, an imminent end times in their day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a question of a pattern about how societies grapple with unfulfilled prophecies, I'm not sure I could possibly answer. My own sense is that while to a self-proclaimed kind of enlightened rationalist would say that if the prophecies are unfulfilled, therefore they're falsified, In reality, in terms of the experience people had of unfulfilled prophecies, that was not usually the case. Usually people would simply say they had miscalculated or they had misunderstood, but they still expected the end times to come and perhaps offered a new prophecies, which suggests that there's a longing for a sense of knowing when things will end.
Sort of, we have a sense that we need to control things in the end, even if the end is bad or apocalyptic. There's still a hope because at least you're in control.
Yeah. So, or if we're not fully in control, I mean, the title of my book, A Beautiful Ending, seeks to emphasize that in the traditions I'm looking at, the apocalypse was not Armageddon or only the tribulations or catastrophic. It was an overcoming of suffering, of death, of tragedy. And humans long for that kind of overcoming. And so they were hoping for the end to come.
Well, I guess it differs from civilization to civilization, but why in general are we hoping for the end to come? I mean, do we really consistently denounce the world all that much? Is our current sort of Western hedonistic worldly life all that new?
Well, I don't think this is an interesting question about the renunciation of the world that you're asking, or an interesting phrase you use there. I'm not sure that was the issue. I think the issue was that there was a sense that, we do suffer as human beings, either individually or collectively. And it feels at times overwhelming. I mean, certainly depending on one's personal circumstances or the social environment in which one lives, this can be of enormous variation. But during periods of, famine and pandemics and war, there is obviously a desire that come to an end. And then in the scriptures, the various traditions could find promises from God that this end time would come and they would be delivered from the suffering in which they were currently embedded. If things are going well, then probably there's less intense thinking about the end. One is less likely to focus on that, or even a collective is less likely to focus on that than when things are really, when a society is going through a particularly difficult and challenging period.
And I mean, that's an interesting question there, just to draw in one of the larger themes I think of your book. Maybe you might disagree, but it's a theme I read into your book. This difference between what happens as we move through to the early modern period, post-Reformation, in that move from collective, church, institutional, where the power is held institutionally with far, far lower rates of reading comprehension. The masses are really beholden to, a few people who are reading the end times to them. Then you move through to the early modern, then the modern period, and you go through to what someone such as Nietzsche would say is that eventually we're moving into a time where everyone is having their own individual religion, and that's what's going to happen post 20th century, but especially post Reformation. And I see that sort of as a transition from, institutional end times to individual end times. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but what's sort of happening in that transition?
Well, I'm skeptical about the idea of the sort of masses in the Middle Ages, getting only their information from priests, and I think it's a much more complicated picture there. But that's a completely different conversation. What I see as fundamental in the shift is the printing press. At least it's one of the elements that I emphasize in the book, and this meant that not only were scriptures, we're talking predominantly here about Christianity and Judaism. The Muslim world did not adopt the printing press until much later, although the production of manuscripts in the Islamic world and the Ottoman Empire certainly mushroomed significantly in the early modern periods. So texts are being distributed in manuscript form. But the printing press, it brought scripture into the hands of individuals or into families in a way that had never been done before. Literacy rates were definitely rising in much of Europe in the wake of the invention of the printing press and the diffusion of the printing press. And it's also the case that not only scripture, but other works, which were commentaries on the apocalypse or picture books about the apocalypse, began to circulate much more than ever before. So it was brought much more immediately into the lives of especially urban dwellers in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I think that's extraordinarily significant. The move from the collective to the individual, I think that's also a fascinating question. And my research is not so much on the theologies of the end times as on beliefs about the end times, which is quite different. Some more popular notions of the apocalypse than highly theoretical views of the end. Certainly theologians, though, in this period had different views. Calvin's view of the end was deeply individualistic, but some of his contemporaries who were millenarians or Anabaptists had deeply collectivist views of the end times. So both of those were present. It was really a richly diverse set of notions of the end that are circulating then and now.
So from your research, I mean, this as the Gutenberg press, as the printing press, and mass publishing in general, and people can get their hands on quite literally get their hands on the documents of the end times. Does this, on a social level, bring about any sort of, I guess you'd say, noticeable social changes? So one thing I've heard is that, you mentioned there actually Calvin and his very individualistic form of the end time, that I've heard, and this may or may not be true, but as double predestination and this idea of sort of your lot in life is sort of, done and dusted in a way, this brought about actually sort of mass anxiety for a lot of people. And you see the arrival of many of the signs of what we now consider quite clear anxiety and neuroses in a way, but that may be incorrect. But the general question there is, as the ideas begin to spread about civilization more generally, does that bring about clear social changes?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, this is sort of the thesis of my book, that the diffusion of these ideas is generative of many social changes that take place in this period. And the most sort of accessible example, I believe, I give of this is the story of Christopher Columbus. Mm-hmm. So Columbus was certainly ambitious to grow extraordinarily wealthy, and we all know that his favorite question in the Caribbean was, where is the goal? And many of his journeys from island to island were shaped by this particular question. But he was also deeply influenced by a kind of Spanish Franciscan emphasis on apocalypticism, and also by scripture. There's a passage in the Gospel of Matthew in which Jesus tells his disciples, the end will come when the good news of the kingdom has been proclaimed throughout the world. And so Columbus saw himself as the bearer of Christ to other parts of the globe, which he believed would then convert to Christianity. And the beautiful ending, the end times, could only come about once this had been accomplished. This is how he enters into the sacred drama. He's not a passive recipient of the prophecies. He himself is going to act upon them to help bring about the end. And I believe that not only he, but many of the missionaries who went to the Americas and to Asia were driven by the same notion that they could help accelerate the end times. And so one of the consequences of apocalypticism was the intensification or the increased speed of globalization in the early modern period. And I think we can see similar developments in the political sphere and the development of empires and the development of republics, and also in warfare. because apocalypticism often leads people to claim that they're the good and their enemies are the evil, and they justify their violence through apocalyptic narratives. And I think we also see it in the development of the natural sciences.
Did Columbus consider himself successful?
Did he consider himself successful?
Yeah, in the sense of that sacred drama, in the sense of spreading the message.
That's interesting. I mean, Columbus is such a complex figure. I don't think he does consider himself terribly successful at the end. His ending is not, his own personal ending is not the most pleasant. But I think he saw himself, yes, I think he did see himself as playing a major role in bringing Christianity to unchristianized parts of the world.
Hmm. I mean, it's interesting. We were talking earlier about more of the modern day and like communism and, liberal politics as the end. Do you think that, you talk about it as the sacred drama, as this people finding their place within a grand narrative, which is moving towards a beautiful ending. Do you think there can be such a thing as, the idea of sacred and profane? Do you think there can even be a profane drama? Or do you think it maybe falls a bit flat and we never, because we don't have the transcendent,
right.
It just, it doesn't really get its claws into us as much.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's I think to a large degree true. I do think that in the late 17th and 18th century, already we're beginning to see a kind of migration of faith from faith in God to faith in politics or faith in natural sciences. And so perhaps the drama moves to those spheres to a large degree, even while the faith in God doesn't disappear for everyone. We can say that in what we call more secular societies, that when people think about their hope for the future, they think about breakthroughs in medicine or in climate science that will make either individual life or collective life better, or political structures that will make life better as well. So we continue to have dramas, but they're not necessarily sacred dramas.
That's very interesting. So I guess the major question, and I know we've sort of touched on elements of this, but I mean, how is it that the foundational underlying element of the end times, the apocalypse, the whatever thing is which is nigh, how does that really push a civilization forward? How can an end push something forward? Well,
I mean part of me wants to say that we sort of have different interpretations of the word end, right? We have an end to which we strive, and we have an end which is a closure to an experience. I think that when there is an effort, say, to improve a society, kind of deliberate scientific effort, say in late 17th century England, to improve agriculture, to make significant changes in the way in which people were nourished, might be an early example of this kind of collective effort on a natural science level, although it was likely imbued with religious beliefs at the same time. So I think we do seek to improve things as an end to achieve something better for society. What is maybe complicated for us, and it's complicated for me, honestly, to understand, is what is it about a transcendent end that is so appealing? Why is it that people are putting their faith in this divine ending to human experience on Earth? And my understanding of that is that when societies seek meaning, they tell stories about themselves, and stories typically have a beginning and an end. And it brings a kind of closure psychologically that there will be this end when the tribulations or the suffering we confront in the present world is overcome. So it's very much a kind of aspect of hope, how do we hope for the better, either for ourselves or for our communities or for the globe in the future. And one way of doing that is imagining an end in which the suffering will be no more.
Mm.
From our vantage point, today, the secular hope would be more that we would find the right policies, the right technologies, the right science that would provide a good and peaceful life for the overwhelming majority of humanity.
Mm. How do you see that progression of our understanding of the end? I know, of course, you're a historian, not a a prophet or a futurist, but how do you see the that progression of when we move from the transcendent end time to the worldly end time of things better in the world? Do you see that progressing, maybe altering in some unforeseen way, in a different way in the future of how we understand the end times?
I'm thinking about this actually, and I'm really intrigued by this. So, in the States, we have this very significant Christian nationalist movement, which is apocalyptic. And we also have a number of right-wing conspiratorial theories and groups, which also are imbued with apocalyptic ideas. And one of the baffling things, and a lot of sociologists and political theorists and students of religion in the United States are trying to figure out why these groups are there and what's making them so prominent. And, we're a secular society, so to have a significant number of people with these beliefs in the end times, in the religious and transcendent sense, in our midst, is something that requires reflection and explanation, and it also provokes, I think, a good bit of concern. So I've wondered about why, and I think this is completely hypothetical, but I think that these groups become more prominent and influential when politics fail, when the political structures are no longer able to give people a sense of security about their individual lives. And we're in a moment in which the political realm is not something that meets the needs of many, many people. And that may lead them to be more receptive to these religious ideas about the end times. For people for whom the social system, the economic system works well, they're much less tempted to embrace notions of the apocalyptic because things are going okay for them, if not very well for them. So I'm wondering about the kind of inverse relationship between a kind of functioning, maybe even progressive political sphere that brings about benefits to large numbers of people. And when that fails, perhaps apocalypticism comes back. I don't think apocalypticism is ever going to vanish. I think it's too much embedded in us as a way of thinking about historical change.
This idea of apocalypticism is actually something somewhat fascinates me in terms of media and in terms of cinematic or literary media, and throughout history as well. I mean, it seems every year there's about 1,001 end of the world or zombie apocalypse movies, and we have a distinct media-based fascination with wanting to go see the end of the world on the screen or in a book. And do you, of course I'm talking about all of history here, but has there been a shift in the sense that in the apocalyptic media that I see now, there isn't necessarily a point to it. It's just the apocalypse for its own sake, and there isn't always an underpinning of hope. Whereas was there a different appreciation of the apocalypse fictionally and literarily in history as opposed to today?
Yeah, I think there's a huge shift. I have to confess that I am not a fantasy film person or reader. So my knowledge of contemporary apocalyptic popular culture is extremely limited. I'm deeply aware that these themes are in the cinema and in popular novels and in popular discussions. I'm very aware of that. And I think you're right. I think my sense of this literature or these films is that they're not presenting a beautiful ending at all. They're not hopeful. They're often films in which we, I suppose, confront some of our most abject fears about what the future could look like. I think that's radically different from the kind of apocalypticism that I've studied, in which, I think I came to see that in a way I had written a book about hope, about the history of hope, and that apocalypticism was what had enabled many people to be hopeful about the future in the 15th, 16th, and early 17th century. And then I think hope tends to shift in the Enlightenment away from apocalypticism to the idea of progress, a new construction, in my view, of primarily the second half of the 18th century that has been until recently profoundly influential in how we hope about the future.
Mm-hmm. The great myth of progress. Do you, I mean, just a personal question, do you still have hope?
Do I personally have hope?
Yeah. For where we're going, I guess, as a human species, or do you, I guess, to draw in your own work, or do you see perhaps a cycle of history beginning again where we make that grave error of which humans are constantly making, of thinking that just by going back to a time when we believed things to be better in maybe a value or a traditional sense, that that will somehow work again now, even though, that time has been and passed. Do you see us maybe beginning again in a false way?
Well, I think that I think I'm thinking about hope as a historian. I'm interested in the history of hope. But I'm thinking about hope now as a historian, I'm sure, because I do think as a culture right now, we're finding it difficult to have shared values of hope. And I do think that, there's a spectrum of how dire people think the next century is going to be. And so I do have hope. I do sense that, for example, on the issue of climate change, that there are many, many initiatives, not necessarily at the global or national levels, but also many initiatives at municipal levels, even at corporate levels, in which people are trying to address questions of how do we transition away from fossil fuels. It may be too slow. We've waited far too long to become serious about this, but I have some hope there. And I also have some hope that democracies will survive, as difficult as the last 10 years has been, not only here in the United States, but around much of the planet. We see really powerful protests in China and in Iran against authoritarianism, and we see a fight for democracy in the war in Ukraine as well. So I think that I have hope. I don't want to have a false hope. I think we are going to remain in a very difficult time for many years to come. But I also think that we will eventually see ourselves pulling out of this. When that eventually is, I have no idea. But
are you a religious man?
I am a searcher, I would say. I am a religious person, but more, I think my lifelong interest in religion is itself a kind of clue that I don't really have a simple faith.
Okay. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add about your book that you feel we've critically overlooked, or anything you'd like to add in?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of the things that are really central to the book. The one thing I would say is that, when you write a book, you're writing a book, you're inside your research and you're reading and you're thinking, and it's not until you're done that you kind of think, oh, wow, that's something that I wish I had pulled out even more. But I do say at one point that I see modernity itself as a kind of apocalyptic project.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to stress that I don't mean all the wonderful things about modernity. I also see that a lot of the violence built into the modern grows out of the apocalyptic as well. The apocalyptic is a kind of two-faced belief system, and it often creates a sense of insiders and outsiders. And so the wars of religion or the colonization of the New World were driven by apocalyptic fantasies in which people genuinely saw their enemies as diabolical, who should be overcome in order to bring about what they saw as a beautiful ending. So the beautiful ending does carry with it some quite horrific things in its wake. And so I would like to stress that, and that I think it's interesting to think about the modern. We have, for example, in my field of early modern European history, or history in general, when we think about the modern, we usually talk about the growth of capitalism, the development of trade, growth of the printing press, growth of communications, rational developments, the Enlightenment, all is leading to the modern world. And what I'm trying to suggest is that, and you see that beautifully actually illustrated in a really fascinating and beautifully, beautifully written book by Stephen Greenblatt, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. And that book is about the recovery of Lucretius, who had an atomistic view of nature, which was fundamentally opposed to notions of Christianity. And Greenblatt's argument is that this sort of non-Christian view of the natural world creates the modern world. I'm arguing that Christianity, Islam, Judaism, ideas about the end are woven into the modern, that they've shaped the modern, and they continue to shape the modern down to our own time.
You don't think we'll ever lose them?
That's a really complicated. You're asking me to be a prophet.
I'm sorry. I guess maybe to rephrase the question, you don't think we'll ever lose, because my understanding of Lucretius is there is this element of what he calls the clinamen, this random atomic swerve from the field of atoms is vastly different to. I guess I'd rephrase the question to, will we ever lose the structures of monotheistic religion, which is vastly different to that Lucretian atomistic sort of chaos.
The one thing that's so interesting to me about history, and that I try to convey to my students, because, I teach both graduate and undergraduate students, but predominantly undergraduates, many of whom have had, secondary school classes about history, and the really good ones see everything falling into place in a certain way, is that, you didn't know in 1788 that the French Revolution was going to happen in 1789. You didn't know on September 10th, 2001, that the World Trade Center was going to be attacked the next day. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. And I think history is a really worthy subject for both students and for the public. I mean, it's something that everyone should be reading and thinking about history. And I think there is a lot of popular history through the cinema, for example. But it's important because it can give us a sense of humility about what we're able to know about the future. It can also give us a sense of what likely continuities are going to be. And, I think that we are in a way surprised in the 21st century how powerful religion remains as a force in global politics and national politics. And we're possibly even surprised how powerful nationalism remains in the age of globalization. So we have certain continuities that are difficult to, certain aspects of our experience that we're able to think are just going to vanish. They're not going to simply vanish. At the same time, I think history is really a reminder that, we don't know what's going to happen in the next week. You and I have no idea what's going to happen in the next hour, much less in the next 10 years.
I think you can find a lot of hope in that.
I do too. I do too. The unpredictability opens up spaces for hope.
That's a great little quote to end on. And unless, of course, you have anything more to add in, but the book can be found, A Beautiful Ending, The Apocalyptic Imagination and the Making of the Modern World. I'm sure it can be found on the Yale University Press website and also found on, online and all the usual places. But I'll be sure to put the links in the description below. Is there anything you'd like to add? I mean, what are you working on now? Are you taking a break from looking to the end?
Well, I'm actually I'm beginning to think about the history of hope as a possible subject that I'm working on. I've given a couple of talks on that and am poking around in that area, but I have no idea what form that will take.
Okay, well, I very much hope that book is written. John Jeffries Martin, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James, very much. Thank you.